Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate a path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, I'm so glad to welcome Nick Amigone from Amulet Capital, where we're going to be reflecting on our previous episode with Don DePathisi, who is really talking about the role of the board chair, and how a CEO can establish a great rapport with the board. In today's conversation, we're going to be reflecting on similar themes and how to establish that role of the board and the CEO's level of transparency with the board, as well as making sure that you're leveraging the board in a really strategic way as you're building out your biotech. So, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. To start us off, would you mind giving a little bit of an overview of yourself and Amulet?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. So, Nick Amigone. I'm with Amulet Capital Partners. We're a middle market private equity firm that focuses exclusively on healthcare. For full disclosure, we are the majority investor in SSI Strategy, which is how I know Kim so well. And I think important to point out, the investments that we make are largely control investments where we're taking a majority position of the shares and acting as the majority voice in the boardroom, which is a little bit different than some of the things that Don described. And I know we'll go into a little bit of detail on that. Just to round out on Amulet, we have made 13 investments since we got started in 2015. And of those 13, 6 have been in pharma services. So we've been active investors across R&D, commercialization, and of course, consulting and supporting pharma and biotech companies, not investing in the pharma and biotech companies themselves, but in the picks and shovels, as people say.
I like the picks and shovels analogy. It sounds right for what we do day to day. Nick, given that great background, can you talk to us maybe to start us off on the differences between these different board structures, even how you introduced how Amulet invests and the difference between what Don was describing? Can you even just give a high level lay of the land of what is the difference and how should people be thinking about that?
Sure, absolutely. I think on one end of the spectrum, you have a public company board where you have a lot of shareholders or board members who tend to be smaller shareholders, if at all, and their real function is to stand in for the shareholders and make sure that they're representing the shareholders' voice, especially in areas where the shareholders' interests may diverge from the management team's interests. Of course, they're experts from the industry or from other aspects of the business world where they can lend their experience and their help to the management team. But that fiduciary duty element is very important in that public company setting. And then, of course, none of them is the majority shareholder. They all have their voice in the boardroom, but no one necessarily has a majority voice. Moving across the spectrum, you have the VC board along the lines of what Don was describing, where the people on the board are shareholders and usually meaningful shareholders, but no individual shareholder constitutes a majority. And so they all have their voice and their opinion, but no voice necessarily speaks louder than the others. And so can be a challenging dynamic for the CEO to manage, or some CEOs find it to be a better dynamic where there's not a majority shareholder. And then on the other end of the spectrum, which is where we operate, we tend to have a majority position in the equity of the companies that we own, and therefore are the majority shareholder and control a majority of the board seats. So we do usually have the deciding vote in areas where there may be a conflict among the board members. All of that said, the whole reason to have a board is that we want to solicit additional perspectives other than our own, and we want to have constructive debate. But at the end of a debate, if there is a difference of opinion and we need to achieve alignment, we as the majority shareholders can make that happen.
Absolutely. That's a really great overview. I appreciate that. And one of the things that Don specifically spoke about, and I know, Nick, you and I have reflected on offline a little bit, is this idea that as a CEO or an executive team is bringing updates to the board, that it's really important to leverage the board in a strategic way, regardless of the type of board that you have or the type of organization that is your kind of primary investor. And so I really appreciated his point of bring 3 key questions that you want to make sure that you have answered in a board meeting. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on what makes a really productive board meeting? And as a strategic investor and a strategic board member, what are you hoping to get in advance or during these meetings that you're having with your portfolio companies?
No, I agree with that. I really enjoyed that part of his talk as well, because if you're going to have a board, there's not much point in just having the same quarterly board meeting over and over where you report out on the results and everybody kind of nods their heads. If you're soliciting the perspectives of board members who have expertise in different areas of your field, I think it really is helpful for the CEO to think about, and maybe in conjunction with the chairman, to think about, well, what are the strategic decisions that we need to make in the next quarter or the next year or the next 5 years? And what are the decisions in that, a subset of those decisions where the perspectives of the board can really be valuable? And then organize the conversation around those things. Of course, it doesn't help if it's just a open question without any fact base. I think using the board materials to establish the fact base and getting those board materials to the board members in advance so they can read it and come familiar with the fact base is the best way to ensure a productive discussion. But once you've achieved that, if you can make the board meeting about discussing and debating those three issues, it's a much more productive setting than, as I said, just reporting the same information over and over quarter after quarter.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's pretty much table stakes to have good, infrastructure for the baseline report, making sure that gets out in advance. I liked one of the points that Don had made around if you have a board that shows up and they didn't read the materials, you probably don't want them on your board anyway. You want people to show up prepared. And so on the other side of that, what are you looking for from a CEO or an executive team coming into your board meetings? How do you want them to be prepared for the conversations that you're walking into?
Yeah, I think, as I said, making sure that the materials are provided in advance so that people can read them and that the information is transparently available to everyone. I think coming in ready to have that open discussion and not necessarily walking in with the decision pre-wired. Obviously we need our CEOs to lead the company, and day-to-day leadership is their job. And we want them to have opinions because they're the ones closest to the facts on the ground. But in order for the discussion at the board level to be worthwhile, you do have to come in with somewhat of an open mind. And that's, as we see it, the best way to make a productive discussion.
Absolutely. I definitely see that. And one thing that you just touched on that I want to dig in a little bit deeper is this idea of transparency. And at what point an organization should be raising risks? How do you think about kind of risk mitigation at the board level? At what point is it productive versus kind of not enough or way too much? How do you think about that balance?
Yeah, well, going back to the discussion with Don, I think some of the things he said around having the right KPIs and OKRs that get reported out regularly, and in our case, as a controlling shareholder, we're usually getting monthly financial and operating information in advance of the board meetings. So having the right KPIs and OKRs allows you to be in a position where if a trend is developing in the wrong direction, it's right there for everyone to see. And it doesn't have to become a matter of opinion. We're all looking at the same facts. Then there are, of course, risks that are outside what you could foresee with any KPIs or OKRs. And in those cases, bad news is always best when it travels fast, right? So I think if risks are developing, for the CEO to have a regular dialogue with the shareholders and the board members about that is very important. Obviously, it doesn't have to be every other day because in the day-to-day running of a business, there are things that pop up. But if it's getting to the point where the CEO sees that a risk is developing, I think talking to the board and the shareholders, even in an informal way, is a really good idea. Doing it as fast as possible is the way to go.
Totally agree. And I would hope that you think we're pretty good at that, at least on our end. To shift gears a little bit, one area that Don spoke quite a bit about was the role of the board chair and the importance of that, recognizing it's a little bit different in the private equity space and kind of with the majority ownership. One thing that I think is really unique is the role of the independent board member. And I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective on how you even go about selecting an independent board member, how you think about bringing those people into the fold and the perspectives that you're really looking to balance as you identify those folks. I
think subject matter expertise is important. I don't think every single independent board member needs to have it, but if you are recruiting independent board members, at least one of them should have the subject matter expertise and the ability to tell the CEO, I've been through some of the things that you are going through, and this is how I handled it. Sometimes it's good to have the voice of the customer. We do that with some of our companies where if the customer base is pharma, you try and find a pharma executive who's bought the services that this company offers so you can see it from the customer side. And then I think in general, just people who are focused and, like we've been saying, read the materials in advance and aren't on 10 different boards and are willing to make this an important part of their professional life.
It's incredible. I think the independent board member role, at least in our structure and in the same way that Don was talking about the board chair, is such an important, I would say, thought partner to the leadership team to really kind of be the balance of either the experience setter. I love that idea of the customer or the voice of the customer really in managing your business on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I said, we're majority controlling private equity, so we don't necessarily need a board chair. But in the other two flavors of board structures, the VC board or the public company board, the board chair can play a really important role in being somewhat of the funnel through which the board's perspectives go that get filtered through to the CEO and for the CEO to communicate back to the board. So that, in some of these public company boards, you could have 12 or 15 people on the board, and it could be a full-time job for the CEO to communicate with all of them. So for the chairman to be able to coordinate a lot of that and free up the CEO's time is a really valuable function.
Can you maybe think about some advice that you might give to biotech leaders who are working with a majority shareholder board in the private equity space in particular? There is quite a bit of private equity investment in biotech. It's certainly the minority relative to venture investment and the more traditional board structures, but there's certainly a growing contingent of organizations that are really operating more in the structure that you're used to. Do you have any advice for organizations? Obviously, biotech is a little bit of a long game and private equity is not. So how do you balance some of those short-term milestones with the long-term vision of the organization you're looking to build?
Yeah, I mean, along the lines of what we've been discussing, seek out a value-added board and really leverage their perspectives. And then also, have transparent metrics that you're going to use to chart your progress. Don mentioned having a card that he kept in his wallet. I think that's maybe going a little too far, but I do like the idea of making it clear what your plan is, not just for this quarter, but for the next 5 years and how you're going to measure progress against that plan so that every discussion you have a clear sense of, are we on track or are we not? And that frames the discussion in a way that is helpful for everybody going into it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And when we think about the overall strategic planning process annually or kind of for the 3 to 5 year cycle that we're thinking about, really keeping the team on track of what are we doing to get there, not just, how are we hitting the metric and are we doing the work just to report to the board, but are we taking a step back and saying, are we making the right decisions that's going to get us to the overall outcome that we need to achieve? And I find a lot when we speak to our clients, people get a little bit jaded by, I need to report X or Y to the board. And it becomes much more of a board exercise rather than what's the right thing for the company or what's the right thing for the patient type exercise. So it's a tough balance from that point of view.
For sure. Yeah. And he did make that comment about how the couple of weeks before the board meeting, everybody kind of drops everything and does board prep, which may be inevitable. But if you're finding that in those 2 weeks, you're doing work that's not advancing the goals of the company, then that's probably a discussion worth having with the board around the things that we're preparing might not be the right things. So how do we address that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it might just mean that you're not having the right conversations for what's really happening day to day. And so coming up with the right structure to enable it. And especially in the more biotech space, there's just not the right resources necessarily in the organization to even allow for that kind of regular reporting or visibility into how you're running the business. You have scientists so heads down in the work that needs to be done day to day, that taking a step back and thinking about the business itself is a little bit of a luxury that they don't really establish the infrastructure for.
Exactly. And of course, the other piece of advice is to work with SSI.
Right. I mean, that's the obvious piece of advice here. Nick, do you have any high-level advice for executive teams maybe going out on their first foray partnering with private equity and, not sure what it's like, whether they were a private company and this is their first investment? Day one, what kind of advice would you give an executive team setting things up?
Yeah, I think spend as much time with the different investors that you're considering as you can, not only to help them get comfortable through their diligence, but also to just figure out if you have alignment with them on whether you're prioritizing the same things and whether you view the world in similar ways or if they view the world in a different way that's helpful in expanding your perspective. I think the more time you can spend with them to understand the personality fit and the professional fit, that's time well spent.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your perspectives today and for joining the episode. It's always been such a great collaboration with Amulet and all the great things you guys have helped us do. So very much appreciated and hope to have you again on the show in the future.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.